was already standing at the door when I pulled into the driveway. Not waiting, watching. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel. My daughter's house, technically my house, I kept reminding myself, looked different in the afternoon light. The hydrangeas I'd planted along the front walk 3 summers ago needed trimming. Nobody had touched them. I got out of the car and walked up the path. My son-in-law, Brandon, opened the screen door before I reached the porch steps. "We need to talk," he said. "Not hello, not good to see you, Bernard, just that. I'm 64 years old. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer for the county. I raised my daughter Celia, mostly alone after her mother passed. I am not a man who frightens easily." But something in the way Brandon stood in that doorway, shoulders square, arms crossed, like he was blocking entry to a place that had nothing to do with him, made my stomach drop. "Of course," I said. "Can I come in?" He stepped aside. The living room looked nothing like it did when I handed them the keys 2.5 years ago. The furniture I'd left, a good leather sectional, the oak coffee table I'd built myself in the garage was gone, replaced with things I didn't recognize. A glass-top table, a grey sectional that looked like it came from a catalogue. On the walls, prints I'd never seen. Nothing of mine remained. Not even the framed photo of Celia at her college graduation that I'd hung above the fireplace. Celia was sitting on the grey couch. She didn't stand up when I walked in. She was looking at her phone. "Celia," I said. "Hey, Dad." That was it. Brandon sat down in the armchair across from her. The arrangement felt rehearsed, like they'd discussed where to sit before I arrived. "We've been thinking," Brandon started, "about the situation here." I waited. "The thing is, Bernard, we've been here almost 3 years now, and we've put a lot into this place." He gestured around the room, at the furniture I didn't recognize, at the walls painted a shade of grey I hadn't chosen. "And we feel like it's time we had something more permanent, more stable." I looked at Celia. She was still looking at her phone. "I'm not sure I follow," I said, though I was beginning to. Brandon leaned forward. "We want to buy the house, from you, for what you paid for it in 2009. The house was worth 3 times that now. I'd had it appraised the previous spring, for reasons I couldn't fully explain to myself at the time. Some instinct, maybe. Something I didn't want to name. "That's not something I'm prepared to do," I said. The temperature in the room changed. "Dad," Celia finally put her phone down. "We've been maintaining this place. We've made improvements. We painted. We updated the kitchen. I paid for the kitchen update," I said, quietly, factually. She blinked. "You offered." "I did, because you're my daughter and I wanted to help. But I also paid the property taxes every year. I paid the insurance. I covered the water heater when it failed last January. Helping you isn't the same as giving you the house at a 15-year-old price." Brandon's jaw tightened. "Look," he said, and there was a new edge in his voice now. Something he'd been keeping back. "We're not going to keep living here as guests. Either we work something out that's fair, or we find something else. Simple as that. Guests." I had never once used that word. I had never made them feel like guests. I had given them the house because Celia called me crying 3 years ago. She and Brandon had lost their apartment lease. His business was struggling. They needed somewhere to land. I handed them the keys within a week. I moved into a 2-bedroom condo across town and paid rent there out of my own retirement savings while they lived in my paid-off house for free. Free, not below market, not subsidized. Free. "Brandon," I said carefully, "I've never charged you a single dollar to live here. And we're grateful for that." He didn't sound grateful, but gratitude doesn't build equity. We've been paying utilities. We've been maintaining the yard. We've been treating this place like our home because we thought it was heading somewhere. "Heading somewhere," I repeated. "We assumed at some point you'd sign it over, or sell it to us at a reasonable price." He said this like it was obvious, like the assumption itself was a transaction I'd agreed to without knowing it. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her hands now. "Celia," I said, "did you assume that?" She was quiet for a long moment. "We talked about it, Dad, Brandon and I. We just thought you don't need this much space. You're in a condo. You said yourself you liked the condo. I do like the condo. Then why hold on to this? Because it's mine, I said. Simply. Brandon stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but he had a way of filling space when he was angry. That attitude is exactly the problem. It's always yours. We've given 3 years of our lives to this place, and you won't even negotiate in good faith. I came here today because you asked me to talk. I'm talking. You're stonewalling. I'm disagreeing with you. Those aren't the same thing. And then Celia started to cry. Not because she was sad, I don't think. I've known my daughter for 38 years. I know the difference between her sad crying and her strategic crying. This was the second kind. I just want us to be a family, she said. I don't want this to be a fight. Neither do I said. Then work with us, Bernard. Brandon's voice had gone quieter, which was worse somehow. We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for a fair deal. Family price, you'd still make money. I'd make a third of what the property is worth. It's not worth anything to you sitting there. I stood up then. I'm going to go home, I said. I need some time to think. Take all the time you need. Brandon's smile didn't reach his eyes, but just so you know, if we can't work this out, we'll have to start looking at other options. We can't keep living in limbo. I nodded. I walked back down the path I'd walked up 15 minutes earlier. The hydrangea still needed trimming. I sat in my car and didn't start the engine for a while. Limbo, he'd said. I thought about that word the whole drive home. I had an attorney. His name was George, and he'd handled my affairs for years. My wife's estate, a workplace dispute back in 2011, small things along the way. I called him the next morning. Tell me what you're thinking, George said. I told him. There was a pause on the line. Then, Bernard, do you want to sell the house eventually, or do you want it back? I hadn't thought about it in those terms. Sell or reclaim. I want it back, I said, surprising myself. Then let's talk about your options. We talked for an hour. By the end of that conversation, I understood exactly what I could do and what I needed to do it. The house was in my name alone. Always had been. No co-signers, no shared deed, no verbal agreements that carried legal weight. What Brandon believed was owed to him existed only in Brandon's mind. George was clear. Issue a formal notice to vacate, give the statutory 60-day period required in our state, and proceed from there. If they refused to leave, we'd pursue eviction through the courts. Unpleasant, but straightforward. What about Celia? I asked. George paused. She's a tenant without a lease, Bernard. Legally, she's in the same position as he is. I'd known that too. I just didn't want to hear it said out loud. I spent 3 days deciding, not about the law. The law was simple. I spent 3 days deciding what kind of father I wanted to be. Whether the man I'd raised her to become was the woman sitting on that gray couch looking at her phone while her husband told me I was stonewalling. On the 4th day, I made some calls. I called my real estate agent, a woman named Patricia Schoen, who had sold me the house back in 2009 and who I'd stayed in touch with ever since. I told her I wanted to list it, not a quiet sale, not a pocket listing. I wanted it on the market, full exposure, best price. When? She asked. Soon as possible. I'll need to do a walkthrough. I'll arrange access. Then I called a moving company. I told them I needed to retrieve personal property from a house where I still held title. They'd done this before, they said. They knew what documents to have on hand. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad and wrote out everything of mine that was still in that house. I knew the house well. I'd lived in it for 11 years. I knew which closet still held the cedar chest that had been my mother's. I knew the garage had boxes of my fishing gear, my tools, a set of my late wife's china I'd been meaning to deal with for years. I knew the small bedroom that Celia had converted to a home office still had, in the back of the closet, a fireproof box with documents I needed. I had 62 items on that list by the time I finished. I didn't call Celia. I also called my estate attorney, different from George, a woman who'd handled my wife's trust, and I made an appointment to update my will. Nothing dramatic, just accurate. The moving crew arrived on a Wednesday, mid-morning, when I knew from years of habit that Brandon would be at his office and Celia would be at her Pilates class. I had every legal right to access the property. I had the deed, the title, and a letter from George to that effect. It took 4 hours. The movers were professional. They took only what was on my list. They wrapped my mother's cedar chest like it was worth $1 million. They loaded the fishing gear and the china and the fireproof box, and 31 years of accumulated life that I'd left behind when I handed my daughter the keys and told her to make it a home. When we finished, I walked through every room one more time. The hydrangeas out front had been beautiful when my wife planted them. She'd chosen the variety herself, Annabelle, with the big white rooms, and for years they'd come back every summer without much help from anyone. They still would. That wasn't something you could take inside a moving truck. I stood in the living room for a minute, looking at the grey furniture and the catalogue prints and the glass-top table. Nothing of me remained in here now. Maybe nothing of me had remained here for a long time. I locked the door behind me. 2 days later, George's office sent the notice to vacate via certified mail and hand delivery. I was sitting in my condo when Celia called. I let it ring. She called 4 more times that day. Brandon called twice. I didn't answer any of them. George had advised me not to engage directly while the notice period was running, and I was inclined to agree for reasons that had less to do with legal strategy and more to do with not being able to say what I needed to say without it coming out wrong. The texts started that evening. From Celia, Dad, please call me. We need to talk about this. From Brandon, this is completely unnecessary. We were negotiating in good faith. Call me back. From Celia, an hour later, Dad, I know you're reading these. Please. I read them. I put the phone face down on the counter and made myself a cup of coffee and watched the evening news. A thing I used to do every night before any of this started. The following Tuesday, Patricia brought 3 buyers through the house for showings. I know because she texted me updates throughout the day with the particular cheerfulness of a woman who has seen this situation before and has opinions about it that she's too professional to share. By Thursday, I had 2 offers over asking price. I accepted the stronger one on Friday afternoon. A couple, both in their late 30s, with a toddler and another on the way. They planned to repaint. They wanted to put in a garden. I thought about the hydrangeas. Good people, Patricia told me. They asked about the neighborhood schools, asked about the neighbors, they're going to take care of it. I signed the paperwork in George's office with a steadiness in my hand that I hadn't expected. I thought I might feel something sharp when the moment came. Grief or guilt or relief. So big it hurt. Instead, I felt something quieter, like a door closing properly for the first time in years. Not a slam, just a click. The 60-day notice period ended before the sale closed. Celia and Brandon were gone by the 53rd day. I know because Patricia drove by and reported back. They'd taken the gray sectional and the glass-top table and the catalog prints. They left the hydrangeas, of course. They left one other thing. When the new owners did their final walkthrough before closing, they found a letter on the kitchen counter. Patricia scanned it and sent it to me. It was in Brandon's handwriting, addressed to me. I read the first 2 lines, then I folded it in thirds the way my father taught me to fold paper, neat, deliberate, and I put it in the fireproof box with the rest of the documents I needed to keep. I didn't read the rest. Whatever he had to say had already been said in that living room, in the way he stood in the doorway, in the word he chose, guests. There are things you remember about a person in the end, and that was the thing I remembered about Brandon. I want to tell you the story ends there, clean and final. But life isn't a real estate transaction. It keeps going. The sale closed on a Thursday in November. That weekend, my neighbor 2 floors down in the condo building, a woman I'd exchanged pleasantries with for 18 months without learning her first name, knocked on my door to return a package that had been misdelivered. Her name was Joan. She'd moved in after a divorce, she told me, 2 years prior. She was 61, retired from nursing. She had a dry sense of humor and an opinion about every restaurant within a 5-mile radius, and she spoke about her adult children with the particular mixture of love and exasperation that I recognized immediately because I had felt it myself. We talked in the doorway for 20 minutes. Then I invited her in for coffee because the alternative was letting her walk away, and that seemed like the wrong choice. We had coffee, then dinner the following week at a Thai place she recommended. Then a Sunday afternoon at the botanical garden that lasted 4 hours without either of us noticing the time passing. I am not a man who talks easily about this kind of thing. I spent 32 years married to a woman I loved, and I still couldn't always find the words for what that meant. But I'll say this, there is a specific kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being around people who no longer see you, who look at you and calculate what you're worth to them, who stopped being curious about who you are a long time ago. Joan was curious. She asked me about my engineering work, about the bridges and overpasses and drainage systems I'd spent 3 decades designing. And she actually listened to the answers. She asked about my wife. She asked what I missed most about her, which was not a question people usually have the courage to ask. I told her the way she read aloud to me from whatever book she was reading. Not whole chapters, just the sentences that surprised her. Joan laughed at that, not unkindly, and said that was either very sweet or very annoying depending on the book. I called Celia in December. She answered on the second ring. We talked for 40 minutes. It was not an easy conversation. There were things said and things not said, and at least one long silence that neither of us tried to fill too quickly. By the end of it, I didn't know what we were exactly, whether we were repaired or just patched, whether the next year would put the patch to the test. I suspected it would. But she was my daughter. She had her mother's hands and her mother's stubbornness, and somewhere underneath all of it, she had a heart I'd watched grow from the very beginning. I was not willing to write that off. Brandon I did not call. He did not call me. That seemed correct. I updated my will in January. My estate attorney, professional, thorough, careful with language in the way that good attorneys are, walked me through every provision. I told her what I wanted, and she translated it into the kind of language that holds up in court. I left a portion to Celia. I left portions to my 2 nephews, who had never once asked me for anything, and who called on my birthday every year without being reminded. I made a small bequest to the county library system in my wife's name because she would have liked that. When we finished, my attorney looked up from the documents and said, "Any questions?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "I think that's exactly right." The house sold for more than I'd imagined it would. Enough to make the condo very comfortable for a very long time. Enough to travel, which Joan and I have begun discussing in a way that feels less like planning and more like the kind of conversation where you find out, slowly, what a person hopes for. Last spring, I drove past the old house. I don't know why exactly. I wasn't in that part of town for any particular reason. But I slowed down when I got to the block. The hydrangeas were blooming, white and full, the way they always were when Elaine tended to them. The new owners had trimmed them properly. There was a small bicycle on the porch, and a chalk drawing on the front walk, a child's work, a sun and a house and stick figures, the way children draw things, basic and direct and certain. I sat there for a moment with the window down, the way I'd sat in the driveway that day 2 years ago. Then I drove home. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't carry anything back with me. I keep thinking about the hydrangeas. Not the house, not the paperwork, not the conversation in that living room where my son-in-law sat in my armchair like a man who'd already decided the outcome. The hydrangeas. Because Elaine planted them, and nobody asked her permission to keep them, and yet they came back every spring anyway, white and full and completely indifferent to whatever was happening inside the house behind them. I think that's the part people miss when they hear a story like mine. They want to know about the revenge, the sale price, whether Brandon ever apologized, and I understand that there's something deeply satisfying about watching a man who overplayed his hand discover the consequences. But the real story, the one I carry with me, isn't about any of that. It's about what I almost let happen to myself. I gave Celia and Brandon that house because I loved my daughter and I had the means to help her. That was a decent impulse. There's nothing wrong with it. But somewhere in those 2.5 years, I let decency become a habit of shrinking. I stopped asserting what was mine. I told myself it was generosity. It wasn't, not entirely. Some of it was avoidance. Some of it was the particular fear that fathers of daughters carry. The fear of being the difficult one. The one who makes things hard. What I've learned, slowly and not without cost, is that there's a difference between being good and being passive. Real decency requires clarity. It requires knowing what you will and won't accept and having the honesty to say so before resentment does the talking for you. I didn't do that early enough. And the price of that delay wasn't just 2 years of free rent. It was watching my daughter sit across from me and calculate whether loyalty to her husband was worth more than loyalty to her father. That's a calculation I put her in a position to make. I have to own that. What turned things around wasn't anger. Anger would have made me sloppy. What turned things around was something quieter, a decision to think clearly about what the situation actually was, not what I wished it to be. George helped. Patricia helped. But mostly it was just me, sitting at my kitchen table with a notepad, writing down what belonged to me and refusing to pretend otherwise. That kind of clear-headedness. The willingness to see a situation as it is and respond to it deliberately rather than emotionally. That's something I had to rebuild in myself. I'd let it go soft over the years in the name of keeping the peace. And then Joan knocked on my door to return a misdelivered package. I don't believe in accidents exactly, but I do believe that when you stop making yourself smaller to accommodate other people's entitlement, you free up room for something real. Joan and I didn't find each other because I sold a house. We found each other because I finally stopped hiding in a version of my life that didn't fit. 64 years old. People think that's the end of becoming. It isn't. It's just a different kind of beginning, one where you know better than to waste it on people who are counting your square footage instead of counting themselves lucky. I don't know what Brandon tells people about what happened. I don't need to. I drove past the house last spring. New family, chalk drawings on the front walk, bicycle on the porch. The hydrangeas were blooming. That was enough.